everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm Kayla and it's time to crack into a good book. So today's video is going to be like a slightly late weekly update. We were actually house sitting for Ivy's parents and I didn't get a chance to really film, but I've done a bunch of reading. So I have 9 books to talk to you about today that I've finished since my last weekly update. And I guess before we get started, leave a bone emoji in the comments to let me know that you're here. So like always, we'll move our way from the lowest to the highest rated. And there's, a good mix of genres here. We have sci-fi, fantasy, thrillers, and like romance / contemporaries. The first 3.5-star book I'll talk about is The Doors of Eden by Adrian Tchaikovsky. So I did this as a buddy read on my Discord channel. And, just, I guess on that note, if you're ever interested in doing buddy reads with me on my Discord channel, definitely let me know. But this is an adult sci-fi book where 4 years ago, Lee and Mal went looking for monsters on the moor, and only one of them came back. So now Mal has miraculously returned, but it's like, what happened years ago and where has she been? So I liked this overall. Obviously I gave it a 3.5 star, but I think the pacing was a bit iffy for me, especially in the first half or so. I think there's a lot of really interesting ideas here, but I did struggle to read this at times, perhaps because, like I had mentioned, this beginning is not quite as fast-paced as the rest of the book. I think Adrian Tchaikovsky always has like some really wild ideas for his books, and this was no exception. I really liked how everything ends up kind of coming together. There are some interludes here with almost like a scientific textbook where it's like you have these different branches of Earth where different creatures kind of, become sentient and rule the world. So I really liked entertaining these different possibilities and seeing, what all sorts of crazy scenarios he comes up with. I also really liked the role that these play in the grand scheme of the story. So I think this starts off a little bit more disjointed with our characters. Like we have one storyline following Lee and Mal and with their cryptid exploration, and we have another that's dealing more with government agents. So I really like seeing how these kind of intertwine. I think the focus overall for the story seems to be a lot more on Dr. K, and I really liked her. So she's very intelligent, she's good at math, she's sassy and foul-mouthed. So she's also transgender, and so I think this brings up a lot of discussion about pronouns and people misgendering her. So there are some content warnings for that, as well as referencing her by her dead name. So, I think this discussion worked pretty well overall for me. It seemed very natural and felt like a nice way to discuss these, issues, I guess, with misgendering and whatnot. So you can definitely tell the people who are actually trying to be respectful and address her as she wants to be addressed, and then you've got some other characters who are really disrespectful and just generally not good people. I also really liked Allison. So she is a government analyst, and she ends up being involved with more things than I think she necessarily expects, and I really liked what happens with her. Lee and Mal were actually less present overall through the story than I had really expected based on the premise, but don't get me wrong, they're very much involved still, but I thought they weren't as much of the focus, I think. So, they do contribute to the overall story in meaningful ways, because I think there's a bit of this idea of different perspectives can bring fresh ideas to the table, and I think it's people from a variety of different backgrounds working together can be really effective, I guess. So I really liked that idea and exploration. And finally, one of our other characters who I want to mention is Julian, who's a government agent. So he was not overall my favorite, but I did really like how he kind of thinks of himself in terms of James Bond. So I thought that was quite entertaining. Along the way, we do meet up with a variety of other beings, and I liked the overall message of working together and I think finding opportunities to change and improve. So I think I'm going to leave it at that because I really don't want to spoil things for this story, but it definitely took me down a path that I really wasn't anticipating, and I had a good time with it overall. Like I said, the pacing was a little off at times, but overall I did enjoy my time with this book. The next 3.5-star book I'll talk about is Angel of the Overpass by Seanan McGuire. So this is adult urban fantasy, and this is the 3rd book in this Ghost Road series following Rose, who is a hitchhiking ghost, and she is finally trying to defeat Bobby Cross, who is the man who killed her all those years ago. So weirdly enough, this is a complete aside, this was the 2nd book in a row after The Doors of Eden that mentioned, I think it's Flatlanders, but it's I had a moment where I was like, oh, that's kind of weird to see that in 2 books in a row, and I don't know, that happens sometimes where, yeah, the books that you're reading just reference the same thing, and it's always kind of a jarring effect sometimes. I don't know. I'm rambling. Anyway, so I guess to start this review off, I had some debate on whether or not I should mention this because I feel like it's not necessarily my place, but at the same time, like, I think mentioning The Doors of Eden, how that had a really nice discussion of like pronoun usage, that felt much more natural. And here, I think it felt really heavy-handed with, I think, discussions of pronouns, white privilege, etc. So, like, don't get me wrong, I really appreciate that this is brought up, and I'm glad to see it in books, but I think this particular instance just didn't really feel naturally woven in. Like, it kind of felt jarring. I think these conversations just felt, like, really out of place and just kind of, like, thrown in there to make a point. And I just wish it had been more naturally woven in. And also, I do want to comment, because there was a really big deal made about pronoun usage, and then later on in the story, several people refer to this being as she instead of they, and I'm like, well, what was the point of that entire discussion asking this being how they want to be addressed, only to then not do that? So that felt really weird, and I don't know if this is just an oversight, but that definitely stood out to me. Anyway, okay, so I'm rambling on, so let's get to more of the review itself. So I think the pacing was off as well here. Like, I felt bored at times, which is unusual for this particular series and Seanan McGuire's writing in general. I think it took a while for this revenge plot to really get going, and I think some of the events here do have a purpose in Rose's overall story with, like, change, but it felt meandering and repetitive at times, I think. Still, though, you know, it's a really interesting world, and I like the ties that this has to the Encrypted series. But that being said, there are definitely spoilers and a lot of references to, I think it's That Ain't Witchcraft in particular, in that series, which I think is like book 8 or something like that. So this was not really a problem for me because I'm up to date on the Encrypted series. If you haven't read this series, then I definitely recommend doing so before jumping into this, because these references would otherwise, I think, be kind of meaningless and confusing. But, okay, anyway, so I do continue to like the variety of ghosts and this focus on kind of like Americana and roads. I think there's some really interesting settings with cool ideas, and with the ghosts, it's fun to learn about, you know, the different types and what their purpose is. Rose herself, I think, felt a little bit different to me than previous novels, and I think liked her a bit less here because she felt more whiny and more like a teenager. There's a lot of complaining about things not being fair, and yeah, I just didn't like her as much here. But I still love the lore that pops up around her, you know, especially being this hitchhiking ghost. I think that's a really fun idea. I did want some more explanation behind this title. With the previous novels, it's a lot more clear, like, where those titles come from, but here it's just mentioned that Rose is the angel of the Overpass, and there's, like, no details on that. Have I ever seen her or heard her referred to as the angel of the Overpass? I don't know. So that was kind of just me wanting, like, I don't know, a little more explanation of the lore, because I think that's really interesting. But at the end of the day, I think she is the type of person who will do what's right, even if it's not easy, which certainly does play a role in shaping her future. Bobby, our villain, he's obviously still a very selfish villain, who I do enjoy overall as a villain. I think I found myself actually feeling a little bit more sympathetic towards him in this book, which was odd, because I think it's one of those things where his relationship with Rose is almost like this, I don't know, almost more civilized because they've been opponents for so long. He still is clearly a bad person, but it's like they've grown a little bit comfortable being adversaries, so that was an interesting dynamic here. We do get to see some returning characters as well, but I think this book is much more focused on Rose and her personal journey. So unfortunately, like, this is my least favorite of the Ghost Roads novels so far. I think a lot of things could be better, and I don't know if she's going to be returning to this series at all. Like, I think for now, this is it. I am kind of bummed. Like, I don't really want to leave it on this note, but I guess it's somewhat satisfying seeing this kind of revenge plot against Bobby Cross kind of come to an end. But yeah, I mean, this was still good. It was a 3.5, but compared to the other books, it just wasn't nearly as fun. The next 3.5-star book I'll talk about is The Last Watch by J.S. Dews. So this is an adult sci-fi book where basically the edge of the universe is collapsing at this divide, and only the Sentinels, who are the exiles and dregs of the military, can stop it. So I think the pacing was good overall. It definitely throws you right into the action, and admittedly, I think this can be a little bit confusing at times because there's a whole bunch of terms and people just thrown at you all at once. And so I had a little bit of trouble, like, you know, kind of getting my footing here. But overall, there's a lot of action going on and it's a lot of fun. So I think there are high stakes for sure. And I really liked this general premise of, you know, the edge of the universe collapsing. And I wanted to know a lot more about what's going on. There are some interesting ideas with the technology in particular. I think we basically have this alien species that was like set on eliminating other sentient species, and so humans fought a war against them and, you know, were thought to have killed them off, but they still have this like remnants of the aliens' technology, and some of it is not well understood. And we also have like these mixed species beings. One of them is much more human than the other. And speaking of the technology, they have like these almost like magical tattoos that kind of move around and they can help increase strength or, you know, protect some of your body parts. So I thought that was a fun idea. And there were some instances where like these sort of tattoos can be used to control others. So I thought that was, you know, there were multiple purposes and I think that's a really interesting idea. It definitely has this vibe of the wall from Game of Thrones, or I guess a Song of Ice and Fire, however you want to refer to it, where you have like these exiled people who are trying to monitor this border for the return of this alien species. In terms of the characters, I actually had a pretty hard time keeping everyone straight, other than some of the main characters. There's Adrian, who is this commander type person, and she is a very high-ranking badass lady. I really enjoyed her. I think she has some good depth to her. She's, at this point in time, a rule follower, but we learned that maybe this wasn't always the case. So I really enjoyed getting to learn about her past, you know, why she's at this divide, and seeing her kind of come to some realizations and act more true to herself. Then we have Capelon, who is this exiled royalty, and he definitely seems like he's spoiled, but I think his heart is in the right place. His family is pretty hated though, so he doesn't fit in super well with the others, but I think he still really wants to fight for a place with all these people, and he seems to have discovered a purpose for himself, which is really exciting to see. We do have a couple more memorable side characters, I think, but the rest really blended together, which was a bit of a shame, and I think that kind of hampered my enjoyment a bit, because I was just like, okay, I can't. Who is this person again? I don't remember. I think this was a really enjoyable first book in this series overall, and I definitely want to continue it. The last of the 3.5-star books I'll talk about is Head Over Heels by Hannah Orenstein. This is an adult contemporary / romance following Avery, who injured herself at the Olympic trials years ago for gymnastics, and this ended her career. So years later, after this really awful breakup, she moves back home and agrees to help train a promising young gymnast for the Olympics. So I enjoyed this, especially after, you know, recently watching the Olympics. This is set in a world where essentially the pandemic didn't happen and the Olympics, you know, happened as planned. So it does tackle some major things like abuse that have happened in real world gymnastics, in particular with the, you know, the US team. So be aware of that. It also brings up depression and I think what it's like to live after being an elite athlete for so long, and like I think trying to deal with like, what do you do now after you've spent your life up to now, like, devoting yourself to this one thing? So I think this was generally well-paced, and I did like the structure of, you know, leading to the Olympics month by month. The author does know what she's talking about with gymnastics, so it feels really realistic. I really liked the bits of romance that we get here, as well as the generally optimistic tone. I really liked Avery, our main character. I think, you know, like I mentioned, she was this elite athlete, but now has to deal with her life not being at all like what she imagined for herself. I think she's really struggling to find herself after this breakup and, you know, has to move back home where her parents still have this, like, shrine to her of, like, her glory days of gymnastics. That is hard for her to handle because she's like, I'm trying to move on with my life, but, you know, my parents are still kind of stuck in the past. I think she's pretty funny overall. She knows how to be a really good coach. She knows when to push Hallie and when Hallie needs a break. So it's nice to see her take charge a bit and like be like, okay, this is what I would have wanted when I was growing up. So I'm going to be that type of coach. We have Ryan, who is a former gymnast as well and Avery's fellow coach. I generally liked him, though I think he does have some pretty bad judgment at times. Thankfully, he is actually a pretty good person, but I was annoyed with him for certain choices that he makes. I'll just leave it at that. We also have Hallie, of course, who is our current athlete, and she's definitely a teenager, but I think she is very focused on succeeding, and she's very driven. She does have some times of vulnerability, certainly, but I think it was really great to see her feel comfortable enough to open up. We do also have some really entertaining side characters. In particular, I really liked Avery's roommate. So I had a really good time with this. So if you kind of like want to, I guess, capture that Olympic energy again, I would definitely suggest picking this book up. So now we have a couple of 4-star books to talk about, and the first one is I Killed Zoe Spanos by Kit Frick. So this is a YA thriller where Anna accepts a summer nanny job in order to have a fresh start, but she ends up finding this community that's on edge after a local girl has disappeared. So Anna actually resembles Zoe, this missing girl, and becomes convinced that they are somehow connected. So 2 months later, Anna is actually charged with manslaughter, but Martina, who is the host of a true crime podcast, thinks that there's more to the story. So I had a really fun time with this overall. I think it's a really great book to read in the summer because she has this summer nanny job. I think it's fast-paced overall, and it does have mixed media elements, which I really love. You know, we have some little podcast transcripts as well as text, so that was super fun to see. I definitely wanted to keep reading to find out what happened. I mostly did not have a good guess as to what happened to Zoe, and I had fun uncovering it. I've talked about this before where it's like, I think not really having guesses can be annoying at times, but it all really depends on the particular book. Like here, I was not annoyed by it because I found the characters and plot to be really motivating. I did actually guess one thing that was right, so, you know, I was proud of myself for that. I enjoyed the use of multiple timelines here. We have the present where Anna is incarcerated, as well as the past that leads up to her confession. So we have this setting in the Hamptons, which was really well done. It's definitely like a fancy or upscale area, but it also feels like this small community. So it almost gives me like a closed circle type vibe, so I really liked that. I also liked Anna, our main character, quite a bit. She's trying to have this fresh start after recently graduating high school, and she's been partying a lot. So she wants this fresh start, before starting college to kind of like reset herself. She actually seems to care a lot about Paisley, who is her charge, and just generally being a good nanny. She's kind of isolated, I think, because her friends back home are a little bit toxic, and her mom is really busy working jobs and doesn't have time for her. We do have a mysterious neighbor boy as well who, may know more about Zoe than it appears. I'm kind of mixed on him because, at first he seems okay, but then I kind of grew to dislike him a bit. So we also have Martina, who is this host of the podcast, and I really liked her. She actually kind of reminded me of Pippa, I think, from A Good Girl's Guide to Murder, just in that, she gets really sucked into making this podcast and uncovering the truth, even if it means neglecting things like school and relationships. So we didn't get to see her a ton, but I really enjoyed her as a person overall. So I had a fun time with this book, and if you're looking for a fun YA thriller, that's kind of summary, I would suggest this one for sure. So the other 4-star book I'll talk about is Ace of Spades by Faridah, Abike-Iyimide. So this is another YA thriller, and this is set at a private academy where our characters Devin and Chiamaka are selected to be part of the senior class prefects, but an anonymous texter known as Aces starts sharing secrets about them. So as this escalates into something dangerous, Devin and Chiamaka must try to stop it before it ruins everything, essentially. So this was very good, and it certainly tackles important topics like racism and homophobia. It's generally fast-paced with this really interesting mystery of who Aces might be and, why they're doing this. So I wasn't expecting the reveal, though, I will admit, perhaps I should have after seeing some of the comparisons. I loved the setting in the private school. There are a lot of, really well-off people and secrets and drama. We do have some people on scholarship as well from less well-off backgrounds, so I think we do get to see a variety of environments. In terms of our characters, with Devin, I really felt for him. He is gay, but he's not really out yet, and especially is not out to his mom. So he, I think, has a lot of struggles with this because he's been bullied for it before. He also does come from a poor background and tries to do what he can to help his mom and family. I felt really empathetic towards him and liked him quite a bit. I also really liked that he was into music as much as he is. Chiamaka is, I think on the other hand, very stubborn and driven. She's dedicated to succeeding at this school so that she can go on to medical school. I think she's harder to like initially because she comes across as sort of being like a stuck-up, rude society girl, but I loved getting to know her more over the book. I think she becomes a lot more sympathetic, especially as the rumors start spreading, and I like how she tries to act like it's not really getting to her, and, you know, she's certainly not afraid to speak her mind. I think she's not always down to earth in terms of what she thinks of people. Like, I think she's a little overly optimistic and kind of privileged, but this is balanced out by Devon's more practical point of view. So I really loved them teaming up to figure out what was going on. I think they had a really great partnership. I also liked some of the side characters as well. I think certainly some of them I initially liked, but I was like, oh wait, okay, no, they are not good people. But on the other hand, I think there are some that become really great supporters. I also want to say I really liked the ending, especially the epilogue, but it does get dark and horrifying as, you know, the book progresses. So I think this is a really important story, and I highly suggest picking this up. I had a really great time with it. So now we'll get into a couple of 4.5-star books. So the first one I'll talk about is The Bone Maker by Beth Durst. So this is an adult standalone fantasy where 25 years ago, 5 heroes fought this corrupt bone maker, Eklor. They were victorious, but only 4 of them survived. So now Kreia, who is the leader, is trying to resurrect her dead husband, but this requires illegal human bones and sacrifice. She soon discovers that maybe the dead aren't so peaceful after returning to the battlefield to get some human bones. So this was so good. I'm not surprised. I really like Beth Durst's writing, and in particular, Race the Sands, which was another standalone adult fantasy, was fabulous. I did also enjoy her Queens of Renthia series. I think maybe not quite as much, but like it's still very good and I would recommend it. But yeah, so I'm not surprised that I loved this. I liked this premise of like what happens after the end. And it's really fun to see the aftermath of a big war when, you know, they're all older. I always find myself kind of wondering, like, how do you move on and live life after such a big event? So it's really fun to see this explored. Like, we have a variety of paths here. Some people, I think, are stuck in the past, while others have made a life for themselves. The writing is actually humorous at times and very engaging. I think the pacing is good overall, though it definitely does slow down in the middle to be more about, like, politics, schemes, and this investigation. But it does really pick up after that, and there are some really good action scenes here. So I liked the different types of bone magic. Essentially, we have 3 different types. One, you can make talismans for others to use. There's another that's like animating things with bones. Or there's the third one, which you essentially just see the future in bones. So the bones themselves actually do have different properties and uses based on like what animal, or if it's a human, what it's from. So we do get some pretty cool creatures here as well in the world. Like, we basically have some velociraptor type creatures, there's giant river lizards, there's like giant stonefish, and even more. So I thought this world was pretty rich and exciting. We do have some fun created beings as well. Like I mentioned, this animation magic. Like, we get some animated ragdolls that are surprisingly helpful but kind of creepy. Like, it almost could lean into horror there. So I think the characters were great here too. Kreia, who's this leader again, she's obviously dealing with her husband being dead and trying to bring him back. I think she's kind of isolated herself after the war and is kind of stuck in the past on this one thing. She, again, is the leader and I think has never really questioned her own decisions, but I think she does realize that maybe she doesn't always know best. We have Zara, who is one of the members of this group, so she makes the bone talismans, and I thought she was really funny. Like, she seems like the comedic relief type character. She's kind of sassy and sarcastic. She's been hurt by Kreia's actions and has to decide how she wants to deal with things moving forward. I really liked this aspect of getting the team back together, you know, one more time. They've slowed down and can't do everything they used to, though they'll certainly try. So I'm not going to go through each of the characters in this group, but I really liked the group as a whole. They worked really well as a team. Plus, we do have some additions to this, core team of 5 that I really liked as well. Eklor, who's this bone maker they fought against, is pretty nefarious, but they do learn some truths about him that actually does make him a little bit more sympathetic, so that was rather interesting to see. they also have to deal with this council that are a bit more trusting than perhaps they should be. I had a really good time with this book. If you're looking for a standalone adult fantasy, I would certainly suggest picking this up, as well as Race of Sands, which is, you know, the one that I mentioned. That's another adult standalone fantasy that's more about like monster racing. So both of them are very enjoyable. Certainly this has some darker themes to it because you're like resurrecting people and using bones for magic. So yeah, if that sounds appealing, like definitely check this out. So the other 4.5-star book I'll talk about is Capture the Crown by Jennifer Estep. So this is an adult fantasy that is set in the world of the Crown of Shards series, which was a trilogy that concluded last year, I believe. And I really liked it. I'll just say that. So here we follow Gemma, who's a princess and a spy, as she goes undercover to figure out who's stealing Tearstone from the royal mines. She ends up having to join forces with this prince from an enemy family to uncover a deadly plot. So this is fast-paced overall, and I still continue to really like the world. I would suggest reading the Crown of Shards trilogy first because the events there are referenced here, and I think there are some spoilers. So I think this does take place about 16 years after the events of that initial trilogy. This is very easy to read and fun. I will say there's a lot of like incredibly detailed descriptions that could be hit or miss for some people. Sometimes it's a little over the top with like food, clothes, and makeup, but it's not something that bothers me personally. So like I did notice it because it's very detailed, and I kind of had a laugh about that and was like, okay, but I would actually like want to eat and drink all of the food and drinks mentioned here. So I was like, there was one, I think, moment where it mentioned like, was it like raspberry lemonade or strawberry lemonade or something like that? I was like, oh, that sounds so good right now. So I will also note that there's some repetitive, almost word for word phrases here as well, so that it stands out a little bit. But, you know, none of these are like make or break for me. I, you know, was really interested in the plot throughout, and I'm curious what Morta, which is like this enemy country, has planned. So I've seen people mention that this is a YA series. It's not. It's adult fantasy. There's some very adult content. There's, you know, some darker moments like torture. But I think in terms of how easy to read it is, like maybe that reminds me more of YA, but it's, again, not a YA series. So like don't go into it thinking that. I continue to like the different types of magic we get here. There are different levels of abilities. So we have like at the very top, there's like magiers, and they're very skilled, but then it kind of goes down all the way down to mutts who just have enhanced abilities like strength. Gemma's powers, I think, are a little unclear here, perhaps because she's actually been restraining herself from really exploring them, so I'm hoping that we'll get to learn more about her powers in the next book. We have some mind magic and telekinesis type abilities, for sure. We also have the Morton Royals, who have lightning magic, and I think we maybe get to see some plant magic. That's not confirmed, but that's my hypothesis. I really like the creatures in this world. We have gargoyles and strixes, which are like giant birds. Both creatures actually do have connections with our main characters, with some mental bonds. So I'm like super glad to see that we have these animal companions here. Speaking of animal companions, Samus is helping me film over here. So in terms of our characters, Gemma, you know, pretends to be this flighty princess who's just interested in jewels and fancy things, but she's really more than that and wants to be acknowledged as such. She's very loyal and, you know, wants to protect her family and country. I did get a little bit frustrated with her because she does blame herself for some like really awful events that happened when she was a kid. There's actually a really great conversation that happened here where someone points out like, hey, this was not at all your fault. Like, what did you think that you could do as like a 12-year-old? So I loved this because it was essentially like exactly what I was thinking. So I was like, yes, I'm glad that somebody has pointed this out. And she's like, oh, okay. Even though I think she does get involved with this enemy family, she's still trying to find some goodness in them, though, you know, perhaps this is not really intentionally done, but she I think is a good person overall. We do have this prince, like I mentioned, Leonidas, who is stuck in this, like, god-awful garbage family, and he's conflicted sometimes between doing the right thing and staying loyal to his family. He's definitely a brooding type of character with a rough past, but I actually really liked him, and I'm totally here for this slow burn enemies to lovers romance. We have, in terms of some of his other family members, we have Delmira, who's his sister, who I think is actually pretty similar to Gemma with how they're perceived. I think she seems like a decent human, and I really want to know more about her and see if my suspicions are correct. We have Mabin, who's his mother, and she is a returning enemy, and I liked how we actually got to understand her a bit more. I think she's very ruthless, but actually does care for her children. Of course, we have some new enemies and friends here as well, and I just generally want to know more about many of these characters. So this was a really fun start to a new series, and again, like, I really like this world, and I think there's a lot of fun types of magic. Like I said, I would suggest starting with the Crown of Shards series first before jumping into this, but I think it's absolutely worth checking out. So finally, the last book I'll talk about today is a 5-star book, and that's The Secret Bridesmaid by Katy Birchall. This is an adult contemporary/romance, and we follow Sophie, who is a professional bridesmaid. She's hired for a big society wedding, but the bride is a nightmare. And then there you have this rival society wedding that's announced for the same day. Can Sophie pull everything together? So this was such a blast. I had such a good time with this. I really loved it. I think it's really well paced with a lot of hilarious moments that caused me to actually laugh out loud. I think there's also some really touching moments that caused me to tear up as well. There are some like sections of like email and texts in the chapters for like various weddings and wedding planning that she's involved with, and these were really funny. Essentially, it was like people are not reading instructions or emails, and it just felt really realistic. And it was like one of those things where it's like, I can totally see this happening, and it's frustrating but also hilarious that it's not happening to me. We do get to see Sophie attend some of the weddings and, you know, plan some weddings, but the plot, I think, is much more focused on planning this big society wedding. So I do want to mention we do get to see some planning of some other ones, including a Star Wars themed wedding, which was really funny. I love seeing all the ideas that she comes up with, the thought that she puts into planning the weddings. I also really liked the hijinks that happened. There's like a swan incident in particular that was absolutely hilarious. Sophie is a great main character. She's very optimistic overall and very good at her job. She's genuinely a good friend and cares about making these wedding days perfect for the couple. She's really patient, especially with Cordelia, who is this bride of this big society wedding. I really love seeing their interactions of the book. I like seeing Sophie, you know, be vulnerable at times and try to be a little bit more outgoing. She also has some like really awkward but relatable moments that were just really funny, and I was like, this is totally something that I would do as well. Cordelia, I think, is really closed off, but Sophie works really hard to get her to open up. She comes across as being really rude, but the people who know her well get to see her nicer side. So I genuinely felt for her when we get to learn more about her, and I liked her family overall. Like, they're certainly well-to-do, and I think there's some not so great attitudes at times, but they also have some really down-to-earth moments. I definitely enjoyed Cordelia's brother Tom and the hints of the developing romance that we get there. I think he gets to be himself around Sophie, which is really sweet, and I'm definitely here for this romance, though. I think I will say, like, this general story is more focused on the friendship element between Sophie and Cordelia rather than the romance between Sophie and Tom, but, you know, we get some romance at least, and I was definitely, you know, here for it. I also really liked Sophie's family. She's especially close with her cousin Kara, who I liked. I think she provides a lot of comedic moments and support for Sophie. I really loved this. I'm definitely going to check out. I think Katy Birchall has another adult romance coming out in the spring of next year or something like that. So I'll definitely be checking that out. So if you're looking for just like a really fun, entertaining, contemporary special romance, I would definitely check this out. So with that, those are all the books that I have to talk to you about today. Again, I'm sorry that this is coming a few days late. I just didn't have time to film. So I am actually starting work this week, so I'm a little nervous about that and like stressed out. And I've just kind of been trying to be chill and do fun things, which like has mostly just been, I want to read things and not film. So here we are. Anyway, let me know in the comments if you've read any of these books or think you might pick them up. And for your question of the day, we'll go off of Head Over Heels. Have you read any sports books lately? Or at all? I don't know. That was a weird question. Anyway, I do have a Discord channel, and if you want to join that, the link's in the description below. I hope you're all having an excellent day and are reading something awesome. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to give it a big thumbs up, as that would certainly help me out. But with that, I think I'm going to wrap it up here and see you in the next one.